right now, somewhere in a quiet forest. A tree is warning its neighbors about danger, using a language older than words. Beneath your feet, right this very second, a hidden network older than the dinosaurs is quietly passing sugar, water, and secrets between trees that have never touched. A single patch of moss, no taller than your fingernail, has survived ice ages, mass extinctions, and the fall of empires, and it is still here, softly breathing. Somewhere along a warm coastline, right now, roots are walking on top of the water, holding the shoreline together like gentle, patient hands. And in a forest few humans have ever stood in, there are trees alive today that were already ancient, before the pyramids were built. Tonight, we are going to slow everything down and listen to the quiet, patient world of plants and trees. No rushing, no urgency. Just soft facts, gentle science, and the slow, steady rhythm of things that have learned how to wait. So, get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop and let your mind drift into the calm, green hush of the forest. Because tonight, we are not just learning about plants. We are remembering how to be still. Welcome back to another quiet night of wonder, and welcome, gently, into the sleepy science of plants and trees. Let's begin. Close your eyes for just a moment, if you can, and picture a forest at dusk. The light is fading slowly, softening from gold to gray to blue. The air smells like damp bark and something green and something ancient. Somewhere far off, a branch creaks. A leaf falls, and the forest, which looks so still, so silent, so peaceful, is, in fact, alive with conversation. It's easy to think of plants as passive things, quiet, unmoving, simply existing, rooted in one place, waiting for rain, waiting for sun, waiting for nothing at all. But that is not quite true. Plants and trees live on a different timescale than we do. Their conversations happen in minutes, hours, days, sometimes decades. Their emotions, if we can even use that word, are chemical instead of verbal. Their memories are stored not in a brain, but in the structure of their own bodies, in rings, in roots, in the slow architecture of growth. Tonight, we're going to slow our own pace down to meet them. We'll drift through 4 quiet worlds. First, the hidden language of plants, how they talk, how they warn each other, how they share and sometimes even care for their kin. Then, moss, tiny, ancient, endlessly patient, one of the oldest forms of plant life, still thriving on Earth. After that, mangroves, the trees that walk into the sea, that hold coastlines together, that turn salt water into something survivable. And finally, we'll wander into the ancient forest's places, where some of the oldest living things on the planet still stand, quietly, patiently growing along the way for will meet trees that seem to know when their neighbors are in danger. Tiny plants that have quietly outlived entire civilizations. Roots that have learned to breathe air instead of drinking only from the soil. And forests so old, so slow, and so patient that human history itself feels, in comparison, like a single short season. None of this requires urgency. None of it requires effort on your part. The forest has never once been in a hurry, and for the next little while, neither do you need to be. There is nothing to do right now except listen. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to take notes. You don't need to do anything at all except breathe slowly and let these facts settle over you like fog settling over a forest floor. So settle in, get comfortable, let your body grow heavy, and let's begin with the quietest conversation in the world. The way plants talk to each other. How plants talk without a voice. For most of human history, we assumed plants were silent. They don't have mouths. They don't have vocal cords. They don't have ears or ways to hear sound the way that we do. So for a very long time, scientists assumed that plants simply existed alone, disconnected, each one an island unto itself. But over the last few decades, something remarkable has come into focus. Plants do communicate. They just do it in a language built from chemistry, scent, and touch, instead of sound and words. Picture a savanna in Africa, warm and golden under an afternoon sun. An acacia tree stands quietly, its thin leaves catching the light. A giraffe wanders over and begins to browse, slowly pulling leaves from the lower branches. Within minutes, something changes inside that tree. The acacia begins pumping tannins into its leaves, bitter, unpleasant compounds that make the leaves taste worse, and in large enough quantities can even become mildly toxic to the browsing animal. That, on its own, is remarkable enough. A tree defending itself chemically in real time. But here is the quiet, astonishing part. At the very same time, that acacia releases a gas into the air, a volatile compound called ethylene, that drifts slowly, gently on the breeze. And the other acacia trees nearby, the ones that haven't been touched yet, receive that signal. They smell the warning, so to speak, carried on the wind, and in response, they begin producing their own tannins, preparing their leaves to be bitter and unpleasant before a single animal has even reached them. It's a warning system, a whispered message passed from tree to tree on the wind. Some giraffes, it turns out, have adapted to this. They'll often move upwind before continuing to browse, so the warning gas doesn't reach the next trees they intend to eat from. A slow, patient, arms race, thousands of years in the making, between browsing animals and warning trees. Take a slow breath here. Let that settle. A conversation carried on the wind between trees that cannot see each other, cannot hear each other, and yet somehow still manage to warn one another of danger. The language of scent, that gas the acacia releases, is just one example of something plants do constantly. They speak quietly in scent. When a leaf is damaged, whether by an insect biting into it, a deer browsing on it, or even just being cut by a gardener's shears, the plant releases a mixture of volatile organic compounds into the air. Scientists sometimes call this blend the smell of cut grass, because that fresh, green scent you notice after mowing a lawn is, in fact, a distress signal. It is the plant's version of a cry of pain and a call for help, both at once. That fresh, cut grass smell you may associate with summer afternoons, with backyard barbecues, with lazy weekend mornings, is, quite literally, the plant world's emergency broadcast system. Neighboring plants, and sometimes even different parts of the very same plant, detect these compounds and respond by ramping up their own chemical defenses, producing compounds that taste bitter, or are mildly toxic, or that attract predatory insects who will hunt down whatever is eating the plant in the first place. Yes, some plants call in reinforcements. When certain plants, like corn or lima beans, are attacked by caterpillars, they release a very specific chemical scent, a distress call built from volatile compounds. This scent doesn't just warn neighboring plants. It also attracts parasitic wasps, tiny insects that specifically hunt caterpillars, laying their eggs inside them. The plant, in a very real sense, calls for a bodyguard. It cannot move, it cannot fight, but it can send a very specific chemical message into the air that says, essentially, there is something eating me right here. Please come and deal with it. And the wasps come. Slow down and imagine that for a moment. A plant rooted silently in the soil, unable to run, unable to scream, sending out an invisible signal carried on the breeze, calling in an army of tiny, winged allies to defend it. Talking underground, the wood wide web. If the language of scent is how plants talk above the ground, then there is an entirely different conversation happening below it. Beneath almost every forest floor on Earth lies a hidden network, built not by plants themselves, but by fungi. These are called mycorrhizal networks, and they are often referred to, quite beautifully, as the wood wide web. Here's how it works, gently, slowly, one piece at a time. Fungi in the soil form thin, thread-like structures called hyphae. These hyphae are almost impossibly delicate, thinner than a human hair, and they spread out through the soil in vast, tangled networks. When these hyphae encounter the roots of a tree, they don't attack, they don't compete. Instead, they form a partnership. The fungi wrap around, or in some cases even grow inside, the tree's root cells, in exchange for sugars produced by the tree through photosynthesis. Sugars that the fungus cannot make on its own. The fungus provides the tree with water and with nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen pulled from soil that the tree's own roots could never reach alone. It is a trade, a quiet, ancient, underground economy running for hundreds of millions of years, long before humans existed to notice it. But it doesn't stop there. Because a single fungal network doesn't just connect to one tree. It connects to many, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds. An entire forest linked together underground, root to fungus, again and again, forming a web that spans the whole ecosystem. Ecologist Suzanne Simard spent decades studying this phenomenon in the forests of British Columbia. Her research revealed something extraordinary. Trees use this fungal network to share resources with each other. A large, mature tree, one that towers over the forest canopy, soaking up abundant sunlight, will often send sugars through the fungal network to smaller, shaded seedlings nearby. Seedlings that don't get enough light to produce all the sugar they need on their own. Some researchers have started calling these large, resource-sharing trees mother trees, because of the nurturing role they seem to play, quietly feeding the next generation growing in their shade. Take a slow breath and sit with that for a moment. A forest is not simply a collection of individual trees, each one competing alone for sunlight and water. It is, in many ways, a single, interconnected community sharing resources underground through a network built by a completely different kingdom of life. Kin recognition, here is something even gentler and even stranger. Some research suggests that plants may be able to recognize their own relatives. In studies involving certain species, like the sea rocket, a coastal plant that grows in sandy soil, researchers found that when a plant was grown next to a genetic sibling, one grown from a seed off the very same parent plant, it would often grow its roots in a more cooperative, less competitive way, leaving more space and resources available for its relative. But when that same plant was grown next to a stranger, a plant from a completely different, unrelated lineage, it would spread its roots more aggressively, competing hard for water and nutrients, as though recognizing that this neighbor was not family. Nobody fully understands how this recognition happens. Some scientists believe it may be chemical signals released by the roots themselves, a kind of underground handshake, a slow, chemical version of recognizing a sibling's face. It's a small detail, a quiet one, but it suggests something tender hidden beneath the soil. A plant world capable of distinguishing, in its own slow chemical way, between family and stranger, sound, vibration, and the question of hearing. There is one more layer to this: hidden language, and it is perhaps the strangest of all, the question of whether plants can, in some way, hear. Plants don't have ears. They don't have anything resembling a nervous system in the way animals do. And yet, several studies have found that plants respond to vibration and even to sound in measurable ways. In one well-known study, researchers played a recording of a caterpillar chewing on a leaf to a plant that had not actually been touched by any insect. The plant responded by producing higher levels of defensive chemicals, the same chemicals it would produce if it were actually being eaten, as though it had somehow detected the vibration of chewing and prepared itself for an attack that hadn't happened yet. In another line of research, the vibrations caused by a bee's wings buzzing gently near a flower have been shown to trigger some plants to produce sweeter nectar, almost as though the flower can sense the approach of a pollinator and rewards it accordingly. And in an experiment that feels almost like poetry, researchers found that the sound of running water played near the roots of a plant could cause those roots to grow toward the source of the sound, even when no actual water was present. Nobody claims that plants hear in the way we do. There's no evidence of anything like conscious perception. But there is something happening, some sensitivity to vibration, to sound waves moving gently through soil and air, that plants seem able to detect and respond to in their own slow, chemical, patient way. Electricity moving slowly through green stems. There is one more layer to this hidden language, quieter still and stranger than almost anything we've talked about so far. Plants carry electrical signals, not in the way animals do, with a complex, branching nervous system, but through something simpler, slower, and yet still remarkably effective. When a leaf is wounded, whether by an insect's bite, a sudden gust snapping a stem, or even the gentle press of a curious finger, a small electrical charge is generated at the site of the injury. That charge doesn't stay in one place. It travels slowly through the plant's vascular tissue, the same thin channels that carry water and nutrients, moving outward from the wound, toward other leaves, other stems, other parts of the very same plant. In a well-known study on tomato plants, researchers found that when a single leaf was damaged, this electrical signal would ripple outward, and within minutes, distant, undamaged leaves on the very same plant would begin producing defensive compounds. Compounds designed to make the plant tissue less appealing and sometimes even mildly toxic to whatever was feeding on it. It's slow by animal standards. It can take minutes. Rather than the fraction of a second, it takes a signal to travel down a human nerve. But it is, in its own patient way, a nervous system, a quiet, electrical whisper, moving gently through stem and leaf, carrying the message of something is wrong here. Please be ready. Some researchers have even used sensitive equipment to listen to these electrical signals, translating them into sound. The recordings are strange and oddly soothing, slow rising and falling tones, like a very calm, very patient heartbeat, moving gently through something we always assumed was silent. The gentle deception of mimicry. Not every plant conversation is a warning. Some are something closer to a very old, very patient trick. Consider the bee orchid, a small, unassuming flower found across parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary wildflower. But look closer, and its petals reveal something remarkable: a shape, a texture, and even a scent that closely mimics a female bee. Male bees, drawn in by this convincing imitation, will attempt to mate with the flower. In doing so, they brush against the flower's reproductive structures, picking up pollen, which they then carry, unknowingly, to the next bee orchid they are deceived by. The flower gains nothing from harming the bee. It simply borrows its shape and its scent gently, patiently, for just long enough to complete its own quiet reproductive cycle. There are other plants that mimic the smell of rotting flesh, drawing in flies searching for a place to lay their eggs. Flies who unknowingly pollinate the flower in their brief, mistaken visit. Others mimic the appearance of a sick or dying leaf, the deterring insects that avoid feeding on unhealthy plant tissue, when, in reality, the leaf is perfectly healthy. These small deceptions, refined slowly, patiently, over countless generations, are simply another form of plant communication. Instead of a warning or a request for help, it's closer to a quiet, ancient kind of theater, a costume worn for millions of years, perfected one slow generation at a time. Keeping time without a clock, plants also seem to know, in some quiet way, what time it is. Many flowers open and close on a very precise daily schedule, following what's known as a circadian rhythm, an internal biological clock, not entirely unlike the one that regulates human sleep. Morning glories, true to their name, open gently at dawn and begin to close by early afternoon. Evening primrose does the opposite, remaining closed through the heat of the day and unfurling its pale petals only as the light begins to fade. Remarkably, this rhythm often continues even when a plant is moved into a windowless room, with artificial light held perfectly constant. For a while, at least, the plant continues opening and closing its flowers on roughly the same daily schedule, as though carrying its own quiet, internal sense of day and night, independent of the sun itself. Some plants also seem to anticipate recurring events. In classic research on the sensitive plant, whose leaves fold inward when touched or disturbed, scientists found that when this plant was dropped gently on a consistent schedule, at a fixed time each day, it would, after enough repetitions, begin to fold its leaves in anticipation just before the drop occurred, as though it had learned quietly, patiently, to expect it. Whether this counts as memory or learning, in any sense we'd recognize, remains a gently contested question, but it suggests something worth sitting with. Somewhere inside a plant's slow, quiet biology, there may be a kind of patience that keeps track of time, that anticipates, that remembers in its own gentle way, the patience of seeds. If communication is how plants talk to each other in the present moment, then seeds are how plants speak quietly to the future. A seed is, in many ways, a message sent forward through time, wrapped inside its small, hardened shell, is not just the beginning of a new plant, but a set of careful instructions, patiently encoded, about when and how to begin growing. Some seeds are remarkably unhurried about opening that message. In 1879, at Michigan State University, a botanist named William Beall buried 20 bottles, each filled with seeds from various common plant species, at a secret location on campus, intending for future researchers to dig up one bottle every several years to test how long the seeds inside could remain viable. Remarkably, that experiment is still running today, well over a century later. And astonishingly, seeds from at least one species, a type of mullein, have continued to successfully germinate even after more than 100 years of quiet, patient dormancy in the soil. In an even more extraordinary case, researchers in Russia discovered seeds of a plant called Silene stenophylla, preserved in ancient permafrost in Siberia, buried by squirrels an estimated 2,000 years ago. Using careful laboratory techniques, researchers were able to coax tissue from those ancient seeds into growing, successfully, into new, flowering plants. A conversation with the deep past, gently answered. After 2,000 years of silence, seeds like this remind us that plants think, in their own quiet way, on a time-scale utterly different from our own. A seed doesn't panic if conditions aren't right. It simply waits patiently, sometimes for years, sometimes for centuries, sometimes, it turns out, for tens of thousands of years, for the precise moment when warmth, water, and light finally align, and then quietly, gently it begins. When different species learn to share, most of what we've discussed so far has involved plants of the same species, communicating, warning, and sharing resources with their own kind. But some of the most remarkable partnerships in the plant world happen between entirely different species altogether. In forests where Douglas fir and paper birch grow side by side, researchers have found that these two very different trees are often connected through the very same underground fungal network we discussed earlier, and that they actively exchange resources across species lines. In one particularly gentle piece of research, scientists tracked carbon using isotopic labeling, essentially a way of marking sugar molecules so their movement could be followed. They found that in summer, when birch trees are fully leafed out and producing abundant sugar through photosynthesis, some of that sugar flows through the shared fungal network into nearby Douglas firs, particularly younger firs still growing in the birch shade. Then, in early spring and late autumn, when birch trees have dropped their leaves and Douglas firs, being evergreen, are still quietly photosynthesizing, the flow can reverse, with the fir sending sugar back toward the birch. It's a slow, seasonal exchange, unfolding across an entire year. Two very different species, quietly supporting each other through the fungal threads that connect them, each one helping the other. Through the season, when it is naturally at a disadvantage, there is something worth sitting within that image. Even in a forest, where individual trees are often assumed to be locked in constant competition for light and space and water, there is also this quiet cooperation, gentle reciprocity. Different species, different needs, finding a slow, patient balance underground, out of sight, season after season. A moment of stillness. Let's pause here for a moment and let all of this settle. For somewhere tonight in a forest far from wherever you are lying right now, a tree is warning its neighbor about a hungry insect. A root is reaching toward the sound of water. A seedling in the shade is quietly receiving sugar from a much older tree through a network of fungal threads too thin to see. None of it is loud. None of it is urgent. It happens slowly, patiently, chemically, over minutes, hours, days. And it happens whether or not anyone is watching. There is something deeply calming in that thought. A whole hidden world of communication happening endlessly, gently, all around us, all the time, asking nothing of us, needing no attention from us at all, just continuing quietly, the way it always has. Let's drift now, gently, into something even smaller, even older, and somehow even calmer. Let's talk about moss, the oldest kind of green. If you've ever walked through a forest after rain, you've probably noticed it. That soft, deep green carpet, clinging to the base of a tree, or spreading gently across a stone, or filling the cracks between old bricks in a forgotten corner of a garden. Moss. It's easy to overlook. It doesn't flower. It doesn't grow tall. It doesn't compete for attention the way a towering oak or a blooming rose might. It simply sits there, quietly, softly, patiently. But moss is one of the oldest forms of plant life on Earth. Fossil evidence suggests that moss, like plants or their close ancestors, when first appeared somewhere between 400 and 500 million years ago. To put that in perspective, that's long before dinosaurs. Long before flowers existed at all. Long before trees, in the form we recognize today, ever cast a shadow on the ground. Moss was here before almost everything else. It belongs to a group of plants called bryophytes, which also includes liverworts and hornworts. Unlike most plants we're familiar with, moss has no true roots, no flowers, no seeds, and, remarkably, no internal system of tubes to transport water the way that trees or grasses do. Instead, moss absorbs water directly through its leaves and stems, drawing moisture from the air, from rain, from morning dew, the same way a sponge might soak in water from a damp countertop. This is part of what makes moss so quietly resilient. It doesn't need soil in the way most plants do. It doesn't need deep roots to survive. It simply needs a damp surface and a little bit of light, and it can grow almost anywhere. Small, but almost indestructible. Here's something remarkable about moss. It can survive being completely dried out. If you've ever seen a patch of moss during a long dry spell, it might look brown, brittle, and lifeless, as though it has died completely. But moss has a quiet trick up its sleeve. Many species of moss can enter a state called desiccation tolerance. In this state, the moss essentially shuts down almost all of its biological activity. It stops photosynthesizing. It stops growing. Its cells lose most of their water content and shrink, almost like a plant version of sleep or hibernation. And it can stay that way for a remarkably long time. Some species of moss have been revived in laboratory settings after being dried out for years, and in a few extraordinary cases, decades. Then, when rain finally returns, or when morning dew settles gently onto its surface, the moss quietly rehydrates. Its cells swell back to life. Photosynthesis resumes. Growth continues, as though no time had passed at all. There's something deeply calming about that idea. A living thing that doesn't panic in hardship. It doesn't struggle. It simply pauses, patiently, and waits for conditions to improve, however long that might take. The Antarctic moss that woke up after 500 years in 2014. Researchers working in Antarctica made a discovery that quietly stunned the scientific community. They had drilled into a layer of permafrost, deep, frozen ground that had remained undisturbed for centuries. Buried within that frozen soil, they found moss. Using radiocarbon dating, they determined that this moss had been frozen, buried, and completely or dormant for approximately 1,500 years. And when the researchers brought samples of it back to the laboratory and gently thawed it under controlled conditions, it began to grow again. 15 centuries, frozen, silent, waiting, and then, slowly, gently, it simply continued growing, as though someone had merely paused a very long, very quiet film and pressed play again. Take a moment with that. While entire civilizations rose and fell above the ice, while empires were built and lost, while the modern world as we know it was still centuries away from existing, this tiny patch of moss simply waited, frozen, patient, unbothered by the passage of time. Moss and the birth of soil. Moss doesn't just survive in harsh places. In many cases, it actively creates the conditions that allow other life to exist there in the first place. Because moss doesn't need soil to grow, it's often one of the very first living things to colonize bare rock. Freshly exposed after a landslide, a volcanic eruption, or the slow retreat of a glacier. As moss grows across these bare surfaces, it slowly begins to trap tiny particles of dust and organic material and moisture. Over time, as generations of moss grow, die, and decompose, they create the earliest, thinnest layers of soil. That soil, in turn, becomes just barely rich enough to support small ferns or lichens or grasses. And as those plants grow and die in turn, the soil deepens further, becoming rich enough, eventually, for shrubs and small trees. This process, called ecological succession, can take centuries, but it very often begins with moss, a quiet, patient pioneer, transforming bare, lifeless rock into the beginning of a forest floor, one impossibly thin layer at a time. In this way, entire forests, entire ecosystems, in some very real sense, begin with moss. The gentle engineering of a moss garden. If you've ever visited a traditional Japanese garden, you may have noticed something quietly beautiful: entire gardens designed almost entirely around moss. Seo, sometimes called the Moss Temple, located in Kyoto, is one of the most famous examples. Its garden contains well over 100 different species of moss, carefully tended for centuries, forming a soft, undulating green carpet beneath ancient trees. In Japanese garden design, moss is prized for the sense of age, stillness, and quiet it brings to a space. Unlike flowers, which bloom brightly and then fade, moss simply persists, deepening in color and texture over years, decades, sometimes centuries. quietly recording the passage of time in soft shades of green. Walking through a moss garden, especially after a gentle rain, when the moss is at its most vivid and saturated, has a naturally calming effect. Some researchers studying the psychological effects of nature environments have found that soft, green, low, contrast environments like moss gardens tend to lower heart rate and reduce feelings of stress, compared to environments with a sharper colors and more visual complexity. There's a reason moss feels peaceful to look at. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't compete for your focus the way a bright flower or a moving animal might. It simply rests there, soft and green, asking nothing of you at all. Moss and tiny worlds. If you were to lie down very close to a patch of moss and look at it carefully, slowly, patiently, you would discover that it is, in fact, an entire miniature forest. Moss provides shelter and habitat for an extraordinary range of tiny creatures. Microscopic animals called tardigrades, sometimes nicknamed water bears, live among moss in astonishing numbers. These strange, almost alien-looking creatures, no more than a millimeter long, are famous for their own resilience, capable of surviving extreme temperatures, radiation, and even brief exposure to the vacuum of space. Alongside tardigrades, moss habitats are home to microscopic worms called nematodes, tiny arthropods, springtails, mites, and rotifers, an entire hidden ecosystem, thriving quietly in something as small as a single patch of moss on a garden wall. To these creatures, a single clump of moss is not a small thing at all. It is an entire world, a forest of stems and leaves, towering above them, providing shelter, moisture, and food. There is something quietly humbling in that. What looks, to us, like a small, soft patch of green is, to a tardigrade, an entire universe. Scale, it turns out, is simply a matter of perspective. The moss that built the ground beneath the world. There is a particular kind of moss worth pausing on especially gently, because it has quietly shaped human history in a way few other plants ever have. Sphagnum moss, sometimes called peat moss, grows across cool, wet regions of the world, forming vast, spongy wetlands known as peat bogs. Unlike most plants, sphagnum has cell structures capable of holding an extraordinary amount of water, sometimes 20 times its own dry weight, acting almost like a living, breathing sponge stretched gently across the landscape. As sphagnum grows, older layers beneath it slowly die, but in the cold, acidic, oxygen-poor conditions of a bog, that dead plant material barely decomposes at all. Instead, it compresses, slowly, gently, year after year, century after century, into a dense, dark material called peat. Some peat bogs have been quietly accumulating in this way for over 10,000 years, one impossibly slow layer at a time. Peat has been used historically as fuel, as a soil amendment, and, in very special and gentle circumstances, as a natural preservative. In wetlands across northern Europe, archaeologists have discovered what are known as bog bodies, remarkably preserved human remains, thousands of years old, kept intact by the same cold, acidic, low oxygen conditions that allow sphagnum moss to build peat so slowly. The skin, the hair, even the clothing of some of these ancient people have been preserved for thousands of years, quietly held in place by the patient chemistry of moss and water. It's a strange, gentle thought to sit with. A small, unassuming plant growing quietly at the edge of a pond, capable of holding not just water, but time itself in soft, dark, slowly accumulating layers. Moss in the coldest and strangest places. Moss doesn't just survive in gentle, damp forests. It has found a way to persist in some of the most extreme environments on Earth, and beyond it, in Antarctica. Small patches of moss cling to bare rock in a handful of ice. Free coastal areas, enduring months of complete darkness, temperatures far below freezing, and winds strong enough to strip soil from stone. And yet, in the brief weeks of the Antarctic summer, when the sun finally returns, these small, patient colonies quietly resume growing, adding perhaps only a few millimeters of new growth before the darkness returns once more. Researchers have even sent moss and other simple plants into orbit and briefly to the exterior of the International Space Station to study how they respond to the vacuum, radiation, and extreme temperature swings of space. While most complex forms of moss cannot survive prolonged, direct exposure to the vacuum of space itself, some of its spores and certain related organisms have shown a remarkable ability to endure short periods of exposure to conditions no other form of plant life could survive. There's something quietly reassuring in the idea that this small, unassuming, easily overlooked plant, the same kind that grows quietly on a shaded garden wall or between the cracks of an old stone path, carries within it a resilience that reaches gently toward the edges of what life itself can endure, learning stillness from something so small. There is a quiet kind of lesson tucked inside the biology of moss, if you're willing to sit with it for a moment. Moss doesn't grow quickly. It doesn't rush towards sunlight the way a climbing vine does, or race upward the way a young sapling might. It simply spreads, slowly, patiently, a few millimeters at a time, content to remain low, close to the ground, taking exactly as long as it needs to take. And in that slowness, it finds a kind of permanence that faster, more urgent forms of life rarely achieve. Flowers bloom brilliantly and then fade within days. Fast, growing trees can be toppled by a single strong storm. But moss, low, soft, unhurried, simply continues, quietly outlasting almost everything around it. Perhaps that's part of why moss feels so calming to notice. It isn't trying to impress you. It isn't reaching for anything. It has already, in its own quiet way, figured out how to simply exist, gently, patiently, for as long as conditions allow, and to wait without complaint when they don't. The quiet chemistry of moss green. Have you ever noticed how the green of moss seems somehow deeper, softer, more saturated than the green of almost any other plant, especially after rain? Part of this comes down to structure. Moss lacks the thick, waxy outer coating found on the leaves of most other plants, a coating most plants use to prevent water loss. Without that protective layer, water sits directly on the surface of moss, and light passing through that thin film of moisture scatters gently, softening reflections and deepening the visible color, giving wet moss its particularly rich, velvety appearance. Moss is also remarkably efficient at capturing low light. Many species evolved to grow on shaded forest floors, at the base of trees, along the undersides of logs, in places where only a small fraction of sunlight ever reaches. To survive there, moss developed particularly efficient light, capturing structures within its cells, allowing it to photosynthesize successfully, even in conditions far dimmer than most plants could tolerate. This is part of why moss often thrives in exactly the spots where other plants struggle. The shaded north side of a stone wall, the damp underside of a fallen log, the quiet, dim corners of a garden where sunlight rarely reaches. In this way, moss quietly claims the spaces other plants overlook, filling them gently with soft, deep green. There's something worth noticing in that, too. Moss doesn't need the brightest spot, or the richest soil, or the most favorable conditions. It has simply learned, patiently, over hundreds of millions of years, how to find enough, quietly, wherever it happens to be. The soft sound of walking near moss, there's a quieter, more sensory detail worth mentioning about moss, one that has nothing to do with biology at all, and everything to do with the way it makes us feel. Moss has a remarkable ability to absorb sound. Its dense, soft, uneven surface, filled with tiny air pockets between countless small leaves and stems, gently scatters and dampens sound waves, rather than reflecting them the way a hard surface like stone or bare earth would. This is part of why forests with abundant moss cover often feel unusually, noticeably quiet. A hush that settles in gently, deeper than the simple absence of noise. Footsteps land more softly. Sounds don't travel or echo the way they might elsewhere. Even the patter of rain seems to soften slightly as it lands across a thick, established bed of moss. In parts of Japan, the therapeutic practice of Shinrin, yoku, often translated as forest bathing, frequently draws people to precisely these kinds of moss-rich, softly quiet forest environments. Researchers studying the effects of forest bathing have found measurable reductions in stress hormones, gentler heart rates, and improved mood among participants after spending unhurried time in these calm, green, quiet spaces. It isn't only the trees that create this effect. The moss, soft underfoot, softening the very air around it, plays its own quiet role, gently absorbing the small, sharp sounds of the world and replacing them for a little while with something closer to silence. A moment to rest in the moss. Let's slow down here for a moment. Picture, if you can, a quiet forest floor, damp and cool, in the hush just after rainfall. Sunlight filters gently through the leaves above, catching, here and there, on tiny droplets of water resting on a bed of deep green moss. This moss has been growing here for years, maybe decades, quietly building up, layer by layer, undisturbed. It has survived droughts by simply pausing, waiting patiently for rain. It is helping build the very soil beneath the towering trees around it. And within its soft green folds, an entire hidden world of tiny creatures is going about its slow, quiet life. It asks for nothing. It demands nothing. It simply persists gently, patiently, season after season, doing exactly what moss has always done for hundreds of millions of years. Let your breathing slow just a little as we imagine that stillness. And now, let's travel somewhere entirely different. Somewhere warm, somewhere salty, somewhere the forest meets the sea. Let's talk about mangroves, trees that should not be able to survive. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the edge of a warm, tropical coastline. The air is thick and humid, and the light has that soft, golden quality of late afternoon. In front of you, the land doesn't simply stop at the water's edge. Instead, trees continue right into the sea. Their roots rise up out of the water in tangled, looping arches, like a maze of wooden fingers, some of them taller than a person, weaving in and out of the shallow, brackish water. Small fish dart between them. Crabs scuttle sideways across exposed roots. And somewhere above, a heron stands perfectly still, waiting. These are mangroves, and by almost every normal rule of plant biology, they shouldn't be able to survive where they do. Most plants cannot tolerate salt water. Salt draws moisture out of plant cells through a process called osmosis, essentially dehydrating the plant from the inside out. For the vast majority of trees, being submerged in salt water, even briefly, would be fatal. And yet, mangroves don't just tolerate salt water. they thrive in it. The quiet trick of filtering salt. Mangroves have developed several extraordinary adaptations to survive in salty, waterlogged environments, and each one is a small miracle of slow, patient evolution. When some species of mangrove, like the red mangrove, filter salt out at the root level, their roots act almost like a very fine sieve, allowing water to pass through while blocking the vast majority of salt molecules, letting in only a tiny fraction of the salt that surrounds them. Other species, like the black mangrove, take a slightly different approach. They allow some salt to enter the plant, but then excrete it slowly, quietly, through specialized glands on the surface of their leaves. If you were to run your finger gently across the underside of a black mangrove leaf on a hot day, you might actually feel tiny crystals of salt or notice a faint, salty residue left behind after the plant has quietly excreted what it didn't need. And some species take an entirely different strategy altogether. They allow salt to accumulate in older leaves and then simply let those leaves turn yellow and drop off, carrying the excess salt away with them, like slowly exhaling something the plant no longer needs. 3 completely different strategies evolved separately, all solving the very same quiet problem. How does a tree survive and even flourish in water that would kill almost any other plant on Earth? Breathing roots. Salt is only one of the challenges mangroves face. The other is oxygen, or rather, the lack of it. Mangroves typically grow in thick, waterlogged, muddy soil, the kind of environment where oxygen struggles to reach plant roots. In most soils, oxygen moves slowly through tiny air pockets between soil particles. But in the dense, saturated mud where mangroves grow, those air pockets are filled with water instead, leaving very little oxygen available underground. To solve this, many mangrove species have developed specialized roots called pneumatophores, sometimes described quite beautifully as breathing roots. These roots grow upward, out of the mud, poking above the surface of the water like a small forest of wooden snorkels. Their surface is covered in tiny pores called lenticels, which allow oxygen from the air to be absorbed directly and then transported down into the rest of the root system. Underwater, where oxygen would otherwise be scarce. At low tide, when the water recedes and these roots are fully exposed, you can sometimes see hundreds of them standing quietly together, like a small, patient army, absorbing air, waiting patiently for the tide to rise again. It's a remarkably elegant solution, evolved slowly, quietly, over millions of years, allowing a tree to essentially breathe through its roots, in an environment where breathing should be almost impossible. The nurseries of the sea, beneath the tangled, arching roots of a mangrove forest, something quiet and vital is happening. These root systems create a slow, sheltered, protected environment, calm water, dappled shade, and countless small hiding places among the tangled roots. This makes mangrove forests some of the most important nursery habitats on the entire planet. Young fish, small crabs, shrimp, and countless other juvenile sea creatures shelter among mangrove roots during the earliest, most vulnerable stages of their lives. The tangled roots provide protection from larger predators who often can't navigate the narrow, twisting spaces between them, while the calm water allows small creatures to feed safely and grow. 4. Some studies estimate that a very significant portion of commercially important fish species in tropical regions around the world spend at least part of their early lives sheltering in mangrove forests before moving out into open water as adults. In this quiet, tangled world of roots and shallow water, an entire generation of ocean life is patiently growing up, safe, sheltered, and hidden. Before venturing out into the wider sea, guardians of the coastline mangroves do something else. 2. Something quietly heroic and often invisible until it's needed most. Their dense, tangled root systems act as a natural barrier against coastal erosion and against the destructive force of storms. When a large wave or a storm surge moves toward a coastline protected by mangroves, the tangled roots slow the water down, absorbing much of its energy before it reaches the shore. Research conducted after major storms and large tsunamis has repeatedly shown that coastal areas protected by healthy mangrove forests experience significantly less damage and fewer casualties than similar areas without mangroves nearby. In the aftermath of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, researchers studying the disaster found that villages located behind dense mangrove forests generally experienced severe flooding and compared to structural damage compared to villages with little or no mangrove cover along the coastline. It's a quiet kind of protection. Mangroves don't announce what they do. They simply stand there, patiently, day after day, year after year, slowly absorbing the force of waves and storms, gently holding coastlines together, mostly unnoticed, until the moment they're needed most. A forest that stores carbon like no other. Here's something that might surprise you. Mangrove forests are among the most efficient carbon storing ecosystems on the entire planet. Even more efficient, acre for acre, than most tropical rainforests. This is partly because of that same waterlogged, low oxygen mud we talked about earlier. In normal soil, dead plant material tends to decompose relatively quickly, releasing much of its stored carbon back into the atmosphere. But in the thick, oxygen, poor mud beneath a mangrove forest decomposition happens far more slowly. This means that carbon absorbed by mangroves through photosynthesis, carbon pulled quietly out of the atmosphere, tends to stay locked in the soil for extremely long periods of time, sometimes centuries, sometimes far longer, rather than being released back into the air. Some studies suggest that mangrove ecosystems can store several times more carbon per acre than tropical rainforests, much of it held quietly, invisibly, in the dark mud beneath the roots, where it has been slowly accumulating for hundreds or even thousands of years. A quiet, dark, waterlogged patch of coastal mud, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate, and yet doing more, in its own patient way, to gently regulate the planet's climate than almost any other ecosystem on Earth. There's one more detail about mangroves that feels almost like something from a quiet fairy tale. Because mangrove roots grow above the waterline, arching and looping in such distinctive patterns, some species appear, especially at low tide, as though they are standing on legs. Locally, in some regions, they're sometimes described, quite poetically, as walking trees, as if, given enough time, they might simply lift their roots and stroll along the shoreline. Of course, mangroves don't actually walk, but there is something in that image worth sitting with for a moment. A tree rooted in water, patiently adapting to one of the most difficult environments on Earth, developing roots so distinctive, so unusual, that they inspire stories of trees quietly walking along the coast. A world spread gently across the tropics, mangrove forests aren't found in just one place. They stretch quietly across coastlines throughout the tropical and subtropical regions of the world, from the mangroves lining the Sundarbans of India and Bangladesh, the largest mangrove forest on Earth, to the coastlines of Southeast Asia, West Africa, the Caribbean, and Central and South America. Altogether, there are dozens of distinct mangrove species worldwide, each one quietly adapted to slightly different conditions, different tides, different levels of salinity, different types of coastal soil. Some grow in the deep, muddy estuaries where rivers meet the sea. Others cling to narrow fringes of rocky coastline, where waves are stronger and the footing is far less forgiving. The Sundarbans alone span an area of many thousands of square kilometers, a maze of tidal waterways, small islands, and dense mangrove forest, so vast and so tangled that entire sections of it remain difficult for humans to fully explore. It is also home to a population of Bengal tigers, remarkably adapted to swim between islands and to hunt within this shifting, watery, mangrove-aligned world, one of the only places on Earth where tigers have adapted to a life so closely tied to the sea. Sea. There's something quietly humbling in picturing this. An entire, vast, ancient ecosystem spread gently across so much of the world's warm coastline. Doing it slow, patient work largely out of sight, mostly unnoticed by the billions of people living not so very far away. A forest under quiet threat, and a slow return for all their quiet resilience. Mangrove forests have faced significant pressure over the past century. Large areas have been cleared for coastal development, for aquaculture ponds used to farm shrimp, and for agriculture, often because the vital, invisible work mangroves perform protecting coastlines, nurturing fish populations, storing carbon, was, for a long time, simply not well understood or not properly valued. Some estimates suggest that global mangrove cover has declined by a significant percentage over the past several decades, a slow, quiet loss that often went unnoticed until coastal communities began experiencing the consequences firsthand. Worsened flooding, eroding shorelines, and declining fish catches. But there is a gentler part of this story, too. In recent decades, communities, researchers, and conservation groups around the world have increasingly turned toward mangrove restoration, patiently replanting seedlings along cleared coastlines, carefully studying which species belong in which conditions, and slowly, gently, allowing these forests to re-establish themselves. Mangrove restoration is not fast work. Seedlings must be planted with care, in the right tidal zones, at the right elevation, given the right amount of protection while their root systems establish. It can take years, sometimes decades, for a replanted mangrove forest to begin providing the same level of coastal protection and the same rich sheltering habitat as an old, undisturbed one. But little by little, in coastal communities from Indonesia to Kenya to the Gulf Coast of the United States, these quiet, patient replanting efforts are slowly returning mangrove forests to shorelines where they had once been lost. Roots reaching gently, once again, into the shallow water. Life above the waterline, it's easy to picture mangroves as a world defined entirely by water, roots, and fish. But look upward into the branches, and you'll find an entirely different layer of quiet life. Mangrove canopies provide nesting habitat for herons, egrets, kingfishers, and countless other coastal birds who build their nests safely above the water, away from many land-based predators. In some regions, entire colonies of wading birds nest together in a single stretch of mangrove forest, filling the branches with soft calls at dawn and dusk. In parts of Southeast Asia, proboscis monkeys make their home almost entirely within mangrove and coastal forest habitats, moving carefully through the branches, feeding on mangrove leaves and fruit, remarkably adapted to a life lived so close to the water's edge. In other regions, small groups of monkeys have even been observed swimming quite comfortably between patches of mangrove forest separated by narrow channels of water. Fireflies, too, gather in extraordinary numbers in certain mangrove forests, particularly in parts of Southeast Asia, where entire trees can appear to pulse gently with synchronized light after dark, thousands of tiny, quiet flashes blinking together in soft rhythm above the water. A mangrove forest, in other words, is never just one thing. It is a layered world, water below, roots in between, branches above, each level quietly sheltering its own community of life. All of it held together, patiently, by trees that decided, long ago, to grow where almost nothing else could. Seedlings that are born already growing mangroves have one more quiet trick, perhaps the gentlest of all, tucked into the way they reproduce. Most plants release seeds that remain dormant, waiting patiently in soil for the right conditions before beginning to grow. But many mangrove species do something different, something called vivipary, where the seed begins germinating while it is still attached to the parent tree. A small, elongated seedling called a propagule develops slowly on the branch, drawing nutrients directly from the parent tree, growing longer and heavier and more developed, sometimes for many months, before it finally detaches and falls. By the time it drops, this propagule isn't a simple seed at all. It's already a small, partially developed seedling, complete with a root structure ready to anchor itself and enough stored energy to survive for weeks, sometimes months, floating gently on ocean currents, before finally settling into a patch of mud somewhere along the coast and beginning to grow in earnest. This adaptation makes remarkable sense in a mangrove's world. A dormant seed dropped directly into shifting mud and salt water would likely struggle to establish itself quickly enough to survive. But a propagule, already partway grown, already prepared, has a much better chance of quietly anchoring itself before the tide carries it away, or before it drifts patiently, sometimes for hundreds of miles, to a new and distant shore, where it settles gently and begins the slow work of becoming a tree. It's a small, quiet act of preparation, a parent tree, patiently nurturing its young for months before ever letting go, giving each seedling just enough of a head start to face the sea on its own. A forest that breathes with the tide. There's a quiet rhythm running through every mangrove forest, one dictated not by the sun or the seasons, but by the slow, patient pull of the moon. Twice a day, the tide rises, and twice a day, it falls, and the entire mangrove forest quietly transforms with it. At high tide, the water rises around the trunks, sometimes submerging the lower roots almost entirely. And small fish move freely between the trees, using the temporary flooded forest as safe passage and as a place to feed. At low tide, the water recedes, exposing the tangled maze of roots, and the mud flats beneath them come alive with crabs and mud skippers, small fish capable of surviving out of water for short periods, skipping and flopping across the exposed mud in search of food. This twice daily rhythm shapes nearly everything about life within the mangrove forest. Birds time their feeding to the exposure of the mud flats. Crabs retreat into burrows as the tide rises, sealing themselves in against the rising water. Even the trees themselves experience a kind of daily pulse, their root systems alternating between being submerged and exposed, adapting quietly to the slow, steady push and pull of the sea. There's something gently hypnotic about that rhythm when you sit with it. A forest that rises and falls twice a day, every day, patiently, in time with the moon. The same slow tidal pulse that has been washing gently against these roots for millions of years, long before there was anyone here to notice it at all. A moment among the roots. Let's pause here, gently, and picture it one more time. The warm, salty air, the soft lapping of shallow water against exposed roots, small fish moving quietly between the tangled wooden arches, a crab sidestepping slowly across a root, pausing, watching, before disappearing into a shadow. This forest is filtering salt from water that would kill most other trees. It's breathing quietly through roots that reach upward instead of downward. It's sheltering an entire generation of young sea creatures, hidden safely in its shade. It's slowing storms before they reach the shore. And beneath the mud, it is holding on to carbon that has been resting there, undisturbed for centuries. All of that happening quietly, patiently, in a place most of us will never stand, in trees that decided, somewhere in their long evolutionary past, to slowly, patiently walk into the sea. Let's drift now, one final time, deeper into the forest and further back in time, to the oldest living things on our planet. Let's talk about ancient forests, older than almost everything we know. Somewhere, right now, there are trees standing quietly that were already alive when the pyramids of Giza were being built. Trees that were already centuries old when the Roman Empire rose, and centuries old still when it fell. Trees that have simply continued, patiently, quietly growing through the entire span of recorded human history. Let's walk gently through a few of them. The bristlecone pines, high in the White Mountains of California. At elevations where the air grows thin and the wind is nearly constant, grow some of the oldest known living organisms on the entire planet. the Great Basin bristlecone pines. One tree in particular, nicknamed Methuselah, is estimated to be more than 4,800 years old. To put that in perspective, Methuselah was already alive, standing quietly on that same windswept mountainside before the construction of Stonehenge had even begun. For a very long time, its exact location was kept secret by researchers to protect it from vandalism or disturbance. It stands somewhere among thousands of other bristlecone pines, indistinguishable to the untrained eye, quietly ancient, quietly anonymous. Even more remarkably, in 2012, researchers identified another bristlecone pine in the same general region, believed to be even older still, estimated at more than 5,000 years old. Its exact location, too, has been kept private. Bristlecone pines survive in one of the harshest environments imaginable for a tree: thin, rocky, nutrient-poor soil, freezing winters, intense ultraviolet radiation at high altitude, and very little rainfall. And in a strange twist, this harshness may be exactly why they live so long. Because conditions are so difficult, bristlecone pines grow extremely slowly, sometimes adding less than an inch to their trunk diameter over the span of an entire century. Their wood is dense, resin-rich, and highly resistant to insects, fungi, and decay. Some sections of these trees are so slow-growing and so dense that even after the tree eventually dies, its wood can remain standing for thousands of additional years before it finally breaks down. In a way, the very harshness that would kill most other trees is exactly what allows bristlecone pines to live such extraordinarily long, patient lives. They simply slow down and wait for millennia. The giant sequoias, if bristlecone pines are the oldest, then giant sequoias, found in scattered groves across the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, are among the largest living things on Earth by sheer volume. The largest known giant sequoia, named General Sherman, stands over 275 feet tall, with a trunk more than 36 feet in diameter at its base. Its estimated volume makes it, by most measurements, the single largest tree, and quite possibly the largest living organism on the entire planet. General Sherman is estimated to be somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 years old, meaning it was likely already a substantial, mature tree during the time of ancient Rome, and has simply continued growing slowly, patiently, ever since. Giant sequoias have a remarkable relationship with fire. Unlike most trees, which are severely damaged or killed by wildfire, giant sequoias have thick, fibrous bark, sometimes more than 2 feet thick, that insulates the tree's living tissue from all but the most extreme heat. In fact, fire plays an essential role in sequoia reproduction. Their cones require the intense heat of fire to fully open and release their seeds. And fire also clears away competing vegetation and thick layers of forest debris on the ground, creating open, sunlit patches of bare mineral soil, exactly the conditions a sequoia seedling needs to successfully take root and grow. For thousands of years, giant sequoias haven't simply survived fire. In a very real sense, they have depended on it patiently, generation after generation. The old Chico spruce and clonal colonies in the mountains of Sweden. There stands a Norway spruce tree, modest in height, easy to overlook, known locally as Old Chico. The visible trunk of Old Chico is not on its own. Particularly ancient, perhaps a few hundred years old. But the root system beneath it tells an entirely different story. Using radiocarbon dating on material found within the root system, researchers determined that this particular root system, the living foundation from which new trunks and stems have repeatedly grown, has been alive continuously for more than 9,500 years. What's happening here is called clonal growth. Rather than a single trunk simply surviving for thousands of years, the root system itself remains alive and periodically sends up new trunks or stems, which may live for a few centuries before dying back, only for the same ancient root system to send up new growth once again. In this quiet, patient way, Old Chico has been continuously alive since the end of the last ice age. Long before agriculture existed, long before the earliest cities were built, simply through this slow, repeating cycle of trunks rising and falling and rising again, from roots that have never stopped living. There's an even more extraordinary example of this phenomenon in Utah. In the United States, a colony of quaking aspen trees, nicknamed Pando, appears, at first glance, to be an entire forest of individual trees, spread across more than 100 acres. But genetic testing revealed something remarkable. Every single trunk in this vast grove, more than 40,000 of them, shares identical DNA. They are not separate trees at all. They are a single organism, connected underground by one shared root system, sending up individual trunks across an enormous area. Estimates of Pando's total age vary, but some researchers believe the underlying root system may be many thousands of years old, possibly among the oldest living organisms on Earth, quietly spread beneath the ground, sending up new trunks for millennia. What ancient trees remember, every single ring inside the trunk of an old tree represents 1 year of its life. And within those rings, trees quietly record an extraordinary amount of information about the world around them. A wide ring generally indicates a year of good growing conditions, plenty of rain, mild temperatures, healthy sunlight. A narrow ring often indicates hardship, a drought, an unusually cold season, damage from fire or insects. By studying these rings, a field called dendrochronology, scientists can reconstruct detailed climate histories stretching back thousands of years, using nothing more than the patient, quiet record kept inside the trunk of a very old tree. Some ancient trees even preserve evidence of specific historical events, layers of scarring from long ago fires, chemical traces from distant volcanic eruptions, even faint signatures of past solar activity, absorbed and recorded within their wood. In a very real sense, these ancient trees are quiet historians, patiently keeping records, one thin ring at a time, of nearly everything that has happened to them and around them across thousands of years of standing still. The hidden cities in the canopy, high above the forest floor, in the upper branches of the tallest old-growth trees, particularly the towering coast redwoods of Northern California. There exists an entirely separate world, one that scientists have only begun to explore carefully in the last few decades. Coast redwoods can grow taller than 350 feet among the tallest living things on the planet. And up in their highest branches, something unexpected happens. Soil begins to form. Over centuries, falling leaves, wind-blown dust, and organic debris slowly accumulate in the crooks and forks of the tree's upper branches, gradually building up small pockets of soil, sometimes several feet deep, suspended hundreds of feet above the ground. Within this canopy soil, an entire miniature ecosystem quietly takes root. Ferns grow. Huckleberry bushes take hold. Small, independent shrubs establish themselves entirely within the branches of the redwood, never touching the ground at all. Researchers climbing into the redwood canopy have even discovered entirely separate root systems, developing where fallen branches or debris have accumulated enough moisture and soil. Essentially, trees growing their own miniature gardens, quietly, high above the world below. Salamanders, remarkably, have been found living permanently in some of these canopy soil pockets, spending their entire lives in the treetops, hundreds of feet above the forest floor, in damp, hidden pockets of earth that many people wouldn't even believe existed so high above the ground. It's a gentle reminder that even the things we think we fully understand, a tree, something as familiar and simple, seeming as a tree, can quietly contain entire hidden worlds we've barely begun to notice. The fungal threads beneath ancient roots. We spoke earlier about the Wood Wide Web, the vast underground network of fungal threads connecting trees to one another. In ancient forests, this network reaches a depth and a complexity that is difficult to fully comprehend. Some of the mycorrhizal fungi found in old-growth forest soil are themselves remarkably long-lived, their underground networks persisting quietly for centuries, expanding gently outward year after year, connecting generation after generation of trees, seedlings that sprouted and grew tall and eventually died, and new seedlings that rose in their place, all sharing, at different points in time, threads from the very same ancient fungal network below. In some old growth forests, researchers have identified single fungal networks spanning many acres underground, quietly linking together dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individual trees, some of them centuries old, some of them still young, all connected by threads finer than a human hair, patiently trading sugar, water, and nutrients back and forth, the way they have for as long as the forest itself has existed. When a very old tree finally dies, whether from age, storm, or fire, it doesn't simply vanish from this network. Researchers have found evidence that dying trees sometimes appear to pass remaining resources, sugars and nutrients stored in their roots, into the shared fungal network. Resources that are then quietly redistributed to neighboring, younger trees still growing nearby. There's a word some researchers have gently used to describe this, a kind of legacy. A very old tree in its final season, quietly giving whatever it has left to the forest that will continue on, patiently, without it. How a forest slowly returns. Ancient forests are not static, unchanging places. Even the oldest forests experience disturbance, fire, storms, disease, the slow toppling of individual ancient trees. What makes an old growth forest remarkable is not that nothing ever changes, but how patiently and how completely it recovers. When a massive old tree finally falls, whether from age, wind, or fire, it doesn't simply disappear from the forest. It becomes something ecologists call a nurse log, a fallen trunk that slowly decomposes over decades, sometimes centuries, providing rich, moist, nutrient-dense material perfectly suited for new seedlings to take root in. It's common in old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest to see young trees growing in a perfectly straight line, an almost unnatural-looking row, evenly spaced along the forest floor. This pattern isn't unnatural at all. It simply traces the outline of a long, fallen nurse log, now almost entirely decomposed, its shape recorded only by the straight line of trees that quietly took root along its length, decades or centuries before. In this way, even in death, an ancient tree continues nurturing the forest around it, patiently, slowly, for generations after it has fallen. When a large section of old growth forest is disturbed, whether by wildfire or storm, the recovery process unfolds with the same unhurried patience that defines everything else about these places. Fast-growing pioneer species may take root first, providing shade and shelter. Slowly, over decades, more shade-tolerant species begin to establish themselves beneath that early canopy. And it can take centuries, sometimes many centuries, before a forest fully returns to the kind of deep, complex, old growth structure it once had. Ancient forests, in other words, are not simply old. They are patient, in every sense of the word, built through repeated cycles of disturbance and slow, careful recovery, each cycle adding another quiet layer to a story that has already been unfolding for thousands of years. The slowest possible way to grow old. There is a quiet thread running through nearly every ancient tree we've talked about tonight, and it's worth naming gently before we move on. None of them became ancient by growing quickly. The bristlecone pine survives partly because it grows so slowly. It's dense, tightly packed wood, a direct result of centuries spent adding only the barest sliver of new growth each year. The giant sequoia, despite its enormous size, adds its impressive girth over the span of millennia, not decades. Old Chico's root system has persisted for thousands of years precisely because it has never needed to rush, sending up a new trunk patiently only when the old one finally falls. There's a quiet, gentle irony in this. In a world that often equates speed with success, the oldest, most enduring living things on the entire planet have almost always chosen the opposite path. They grow slowly, they conserve energy, they wait patiently for favorable conditions, rather than expending everything at once, and in doing so, gently, unhurriedly. They simply outlast almost everything around them. Fast, growing trees, the kind that shoot up quickly toward the sunlight, often produce softer wood, and tend to live comparatively shorter lives, sometimes only a few decades, occasionally a century or two. Slow, growing ancient trees, by contrast, often produce remarkably dense, durable wood, resistant to decay, resistant to insects, resistant, in a sense, to time itself. It's a strange kind of wisdom, written slowly into the rings of the oldest trees on Earth. Patience, it turns out, may be one of the most powerful survival strategies life has ever discovered. Witnesses to everything try gently to imagine everything a single ancient tree has quietly witnessed. A giant sequoia that began growing roughly 2,000 years ago has stood through the entire rise and fall of empires. It was already a young tree, tender and small, during the era of ancient Rome. It was still standing, slowly thickening, ring by ring, through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, through the invention of the printing press, through centuries of wars and treaties, and the slow, patient spread of human civilization across the entire globe. It has stood through countless thousands of sunrises and thousands more sunsets. It has felt the same gentle rain, the same dry summer winds, the same first frost of thousands of individual autumns, each one slightly different, and yet each one, in its own way, quietly familiar. It has never once needed to know any of this was happening. It didn't watch history unfold the way we might. It simply grew through it, one slow season at a time, entirely undisturbed by the scale of what was happening in the world, beyond its own patient, quiet existence. There's a particular kind of comfort in that thought, especially late at night, when the mind tends to spin faster than we'd like it to. Whatever is worrying you right now, whatever feels urgent, whatever feels impossibly large in this particular moment, is happening within a world that also contains trees like this. Trees that have quietly outlasted nearly everything. Trees that have never once needed to rush. And somewhere, tonight, one of them is simply standing there in the dark, patient, breathing slowly, the same way it always has. Standing in an ancient forest, try to imagine. For a moment, actually standing among trees like these, the air in an old growth forest feels different somehow, cooler and more still. The canopy above is so dense and so high that very little direct sunlight reaches the forest floor, only soft, dappled patches of green, gold light, shifting slowly as the leaves above sway in a breeze you can barely feel from below. The ground is thick with centuries of fallen leaves and moss and slowly decaying logs. Some of them fallen so long ago that new trees have already grown up out of their softened, the decomposing trunks. There is a stillness in a forest like this, unlike almost anywhere else. Not an empty stillness, but a full one, layered, deep, and old. The quiet hum of insects, the occasional call of a distant bird, the soft creak of an ancient trunk shifting gently in the wind, the same way it has shifted gently for 1,000 years or longer. Standing among trees like these has a way of quietly reordering your sense of time. Your own life, which can feel so long, so eventful, so significant, suddenly settles into proper scale, a brief, gentle flicker, next to something that has stood patiently through centuries of human history, unfolding entirely without its notice. There is something deeply calming in that perspective. A reminder that the world does not need to rush. That some of the most remarkable things on this planet have gotten that way not through speed or urgency, but through simple, patient persistence. One slow season at a time, for thousands of years, we've traveled a long way tonight, gently, quietly, without ever needing to rush. We began by listening to the invisible language of plants, the warnings carried on the wind, the underground networks of fungal threads sharing sugar and water. Between trees, that have never touched. We slowed down further into the tiny, ancient, endlessly patient world of moss. A plant so resilient it can pause its own life for over 1,000 years and simply wait for rain. We waded gently into the warm, salty world of mangroves, trees that quietly filter salt from seawater, breathe through roots that reach upward instead of down, and shelter an entire generation of ocean life within their tangled roots. And finally, we stood quietly among some of the oldest living things on Earth, trees that have been patiently growing since long before recorded history began. None of these things rushed to become what they are. The moss didn't hurry through its 1,000-year sleep. The bristlecone pine didn't hurry through 5,000 slow years of growth, one careful ring at a time. The mangrove didn't rush to filter the sea. Each of them simply continued, patiently, quietly, season after season, for as long as it took. There's something worth carrying with you gently into sleep tonight. We live, most of the time, at a pace the natural world never asked us to keep. We rush toward deadlines and notifications and endless small urgencies, most of which will be forgotten within a week or a month or a year. And yet, all around us, quietly, patiently, an entirely different pace has been unfolding this whole time. One measured not in minutes or hours, but in seasons and centuries, and sometimes, in the case of a small patch of frozen moss, in millennia. You don't have to rush either. Somewhere out there, right now, in a forest you may never see, a tree is quietly warning its neighbors. A patch of moss is patiently waiting through a dry season. Ancient roots are slowly holding a coastline together against the tide. And a tree older than most nations is simply standing, still, unbothered, breathing slowly in the dark. Let your own body settle the same way. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts soften and drift the way fog drifts quietly over a forest floor at dawn. There is nothing you need to do right now except rest. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us tonight. If these slow, gentle facts about plants and trees helped your mind settle, helped your body relax, helped you drift a little closer to sleep, let this be the last thought you carry with you. Somewhere in the quiet dark, an ancient forest is still standing, patient, unhurried, at peace, and so gently are you. Good night.